What I've heard of the Spyro Reignited Trilogy soundtrack so far doesn't fare well. So here's why I think it may end up being worse than the Crash Bandicoot and Sane Trilogies. You know how Crash Bandicoot has these pre-console mixes that were released on the internet by the original composer, right? You see, putting that music in the game verbatim wouldn't fit. If you listen carefully, there are subtle differences in the quality and even the volume of certain instruments between the pre-console and the console versions. This is because the audio is sequenced. Sequencing is like MIDI, where it's only note data stored in a single file. What this means is that the note data plays notes from a library of recorded samples, and those samples are played back to make music. The disc only has to hold the very small MIDI data and the samples, as opposed to streamed music, which takes up more space. Streamed music is a straight-up recording of audio, akin to a typical CD or song you'd stream. It is free from the technical limitations of a console, and sounds like the composer intended. This is what the pre-console mixes are, because they were made prior to being ported to the console in sequenced form. The audio programmer's job was to make sure the sequenced version sounded as close to the original song as possible, without sacrificing too much quality. Spyro the Dragon didn't have any sequenced audio somehow. In fact, the only caveat was that it was mono. This meant that Stuart Copeland was free to make the soundtrack to his exact liking, with little to no restrictions. Compare these two similar songs, Wizard Peak from Spyro 1 to the Amanda Show theme. The Amanda Show theme was made for TV, but these two songs sound almost the same in quality. The Sane Trilogy soundtrack already had a number of points in favor of it. They could remaster it with not only modern, higher quality instruments, but they could also use the direct music sequence data for maximum accuracy, and even embellish it. This isn't always a good thing, as directly using the data without careful consideration for how the original sounded will result in inaccurate sound, mastering, and timing. That's why people think the Sane Trilogy's soundtrack is a mixed bag. For example, compare the Diggin' It bonus round to the Sane Trilogy version, where some notes are delayed by about a 16th for whatever reason. There are several cases where notes are straight up missing in some songs too, and surely this can't be a stylistic choice, right? That's the thing. Crash Bandicoot's music went through so much translation and quality reduction on its way to console and left so much data behind to work with that it wasn't particularly hard to make tracks that could straight up improve on the originals. There is not that much room for error in Spyro. Every track was handcrafted with a specific tone and mood, which managed to make it to console with little to no compromise at all.
On these CD-ROM games, there's so much space. I don't have to worry. I can load up full symphonic sounds there. In fact, I have. In this game, I've got whole orchestra sounds that I recorded in Utah.
But that means the composers for Reignited don't have the leisure to work with the direct data. That's not necessarily a bad thing. They could still have Copeland scores or sheets to work with, and more often than not, transcribing the music by human ear is better than straight up MIDI slapping. But what I've heard so far isn't that great. Compare Dark Hollow to its Reignited counterpart. The Reignited version has much less emphasis on the bass and percussion, giving it a much more ambient feel. The original song and whole Spyro soundtrack in general had many progressive rock influences, owing to Copeland's previous time as a drummer in The Police. Sunny Flight seems to have suffered quite a bit in its translation to high def. Take a listen for yourself. On top of the percussion being very heavily gimped, there's overall less reverb, instrumentation issues like another organ being used instead of a subtle pan flute like in the original, lack of velocity variation in notes, and way different volume levels for every instrument, resulting in an overall flatter, less punchy song that ironically sounds more MIDI than its PS1 counterpart. Not to mention that they seem to have given a dynamic score to the game, where the track can change on the fly based on your location. A pretty ballsy move considering the original didn't have one. So yeah, in short, Crash Bandicoot had way more room for error with its remastered soundtrack, given the conversion to console process it had to go through, but Spyro doesn't have that much room for error. This is probably why we're hearing more backlash and more people requesting the original soundtrack as an option. And yeah, I don't really have high hopes for the Reignited Trilogy soundtrack, sadly. But who knows? It's still in development, they could catch on. Maybe. Here's one final note that might ruffle a few feathers. I don't really think the pre-console Crash mixes are that good or have aged well, to be honest. And I don't really agree with some fans' request for Vicarious Visions to use them instead of remastering the soundtrack. So yeah, thanks for watching, I guess.